In 1913, the Indian mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan, a self-taught clerk in Madras with no formal university education, wrote a letter to G.H. Hardy, a professor of mathematics at Cambridge University. The letter contained approximately 120 mathematical formulas. Hardy, one of the most rigorous mathematicians of his era, examined the formulas and later wrote, "They must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have had the imagination to invent them." Hardy invited Ramanujan to Cambridge, and over the next 5 years, Ramanujan produced mathematical results that stunned the world: theorems in number theory, infinite series, and continued fractions that were decades ahead of their time, results that mathematicians are still proving and exploring a century later. But it was not the results that made Ramanujan unique. It was where they came from. When Hardy asked Ramanujan how he arrived at his formulas, what reasoning led him to them, what chain of logic produced them, what prior results they were derived from, Ramanujan could not explain. He did not derive them. He did not reason toward them. He received them. In his own words, the formulas were given to him in dreams and visions by Namagiri Thayar, a form of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi. The goddess would appear to him during sleep, and he would see mathematical formulas scrolling across a screen of blood-red colour. When he awoke, he wrote them down. Some he could prove upon waking, some he could not, and several of his unproven formulas remained unproven for decades after his death, until mathematicians with access to computers and advanced techniques were finally able to verify what Ramanujan had seen in his visions. One of his most famous results, the Ramanujan conjecture, concerning the growth rate of the tau function, was not proven until 1974, 54 years after his death, by Pierre Deligne, who won the Fields Medal partly for the proof. The formula was correct. It had been correct since the goddess showed it to Ramanujan in a dream, and no one, not Hardy, not Littlewood, not any mathematician of the 20th century, could explain how a self-taught clerk in Madras had accessed a mathematical truth that the most advanced techniques of the era could not verify. But the formulas themselves, the raw mathematical content, the specific relationships between numbers, the precise structures that Hardy recognized as profound, came from somewhere that Ramanujan's conscious, waking mind did not control and could not explain. Ramanujan is not an isolated case. The history of creative breakthrough is saturated with accounts of ideas arriving from outside the deliberate, rational, conscious mind. Friedrich August Kekulé, the German chemist who discovered the ring structure of the benzene molecule in 1865, reported that the insight came in a dream. He had been struggling with the problem for years, unable to reconcile the chemical formula of benzene, 6 carbon atoms, 6 hydrogen atoms, with the known structural rules of organic chemistry. One evening, dozing by the fire, he saw atoms dancing before his eyes, forming chains that twisted and turned, and then one chain seized its own tail and formed a ring, spinning before him like the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. He awoke with the realization: benzene is a ring. The structure was correct. The dream had solved what the waking mind could not. Nikola Tesla, the inventor whose alternating current system powers the modern world, described a creative process that operated entirely through visualization. Tesla did not sketch designs on paper. He did not build physical prototypes. He constructed complete, detailed, functioning machines inside his mind, rotating them, testing them, modifying them, running them for weeks of simulated operation. And only after the mental prototype had been thoroughly tested did he build the physical version. The physical version worked on the first attempt because the mental version had already worked. Tesla described his process in his autobiography. "When I get a new idea, I do not rush to build it. I first imagine the device in my mind. I change the construction, make improvements, and operate the device in my mind. It is absolutely immaterial to me whether I run my turbine in thought or test it in my shop. I even note if it is out of balance. The mental simulation was not vague or approximate. It was precise enough to detect mechanical imbalances, precise enough to predict performance characteristics, precise enough to serve as a complete substitute for physical prototyping. Tesla was not merely imagining, he was perceiving, with a clarity and a specificity that exceeded ordinary visualization, a complete functioning machine that existed nowhere in the physical world, but that was fully real in the dimension of consciousness in which Tesla operated. Tesla's creative process bypassed the normal iterative cycle of design, build, test, redesign. The creation happened in consciousness. The physical construction was merely the transcription. Paul McCartney woke up one morning with the melody of Yesterday fully formed in his mind, complete, note for note, with no memory of having composed it. He spent weeks asking other musicians whether they recognized the tune, convinced that he must have heard it somewhere and was simply remembering it rather than creating it. No one recognized it. It was original. It came from nowhere that McCartney could identify, from no deliberate compositional process, from no conscious decision to write a melody in that key, in that rhythm, with that emotional contour. The most recorded song in history was not composed. It arrived. Mozart, in a letter whose authenticity has been debated, but whose content resonates with every creative account we have assembled, described his compositional process in terms that anticipate the neuroscience. By 2 centuries, when I am, as it were, completely myself, entirely alone, and of good cheer, say, travelling in a carriage, or walking after a good meal, or during the night when I cannot sleep, it is on such occasions that my ideas flow best and most abundantly. Whence and how they come, I know not, nor can I force them. The ideas come. Mozart does not know from where. He cannot force them. He can only create the conditions: solitude, relaxation, the absence of deliberate effort and weight. Samuel Taylor Coleridge composed Kubla Khan, one of the most celebrated poems in English literature, in an opium-induced reverie. The poem arrived complete, fully formed, in a visionary state that Coleridge described as a profound sleep, at least of the external senses. When he awoke, he began transcribing the vision and was interrupted by a visitor. When the visitor left, the remaining portion of the poem had vanished from his memory, irretrievable, as though the channel had closed and the transmission had ended. The poem we have is a fragment, the portion that Coleridge managed to transcribe before the interruption. The rest was lost not because Coleridge forgot his own composition, but because the composition was never his to remember. It was received, not produced. And when the reception was interrupted, the unreceived portion returned to wherever it had come from. These accounts, Ramanujan's goddess, Kekulé's Ouroboros, Tesla's mental machines, McCartney's morning melody share a common structure that is as striking as it is unexplained. The creative breakthrough arrives without being summoned. It appears in consciousness fully formed, or nearly formed, without the step-by-step reasoning that the conscious mind uses to solve problems. It comes from a source that the creator cannot identify and cannot control, a source that seems to operate independently of the creator's deliberate intention, that works on its own schedule, and that delivers its results in its own way, typically during states of reduced conscious control, sleep, reverie, relaxation, the hypnagogic transition between waking and sleep. The ancient Greeks had a name for this source. They called it the Muse, one of 9 goddesses who presided over the arts and sciences, each governing a specific domain of creative activity. The poet did not create the poem. The Muse created the poem. The poet was the instrument, the vessel through which the Muse's creation entered the human world. Homer begins the Iliad not with "I sing," but with "sing, O goddess." an invocation that attributes the creative act not to the human author, but to the divine source that the human author serves as conduit. Socrates described his creative process through the concept of the daimonion, an inner voice, a divine sign that spoke to him at critical moments, always telling him what not to do rather than what to do. The daimonion was not Socrates' own thoughts. It was an external voice perceived internally but recognized as coming from a source that was not identical to Socrates' own mind. Plato described creative inspiration through the concept of divine madness mania, the state in which the soul is possessed by a god and produces works that no merely rational process could generate. The greatest blessings come to us through madness, Plato wrote in the Phaedrus, when it is sent as a gift from the gods. The sane mind produces competent work. The inspired mind, the mind that has been touched by divine madness, that has been possessed by the Muse, produces genius. And the possession is not voluntary, it is received, it is a gift. It comes when it comes, and the poet's only role is to be open to receive it. The Greek concept was not metaphorical. It was literal. The Greeks genuinely believed that creative inspiration came from outside the human mind, from a divine source that communicated through the medium of the inspired individual. The Islamic tradition uses the same structure with different terminology. The Arabic word for inspiration, ilham, means literally to swallow or to be fed. The image is of the creative idea being placed directly into the recipient's consciousness by God, without the intermediary of reasoning or deliberation. The Quran itself is described as a direct communication from God, not composed by Muhammad but received by Muhammad through the angel Jibril, who placed the words directly into the Prophet's awareness. And the Islamic philosophical tradition, particularly Ibn Arabi, describes a faculty called al-khayal, the creative imagination, that operates as an intermediary between the divine realm and the human mind, receiving spiritual realities and translating them into the images, words, and insights that the human mind can process. Creativity, in this framework, is not a human production. It is a divine transmission received through a faculty that is deeper than reason, older than language, and connected to a source that transcends the individual mind. The Hindu tradition is even more explicit. The Vedas, the oldest sacred texts in the Hindu canon, are described as shruti, that which is heard. The rishis, the ancient seers who transmitted the Vedas, did not compose them. They heard them, perceived them through a faculty of inner hearing that accessed a dimension of reality that ordinary consciousness cannot reach. The Vedas are not human creations. They are eternal truths existing in the fabric of reality before the rishis perceived them and before the human species existed to perceive anything. The rishis were tuning forks, instruments that resonated with the cosmic vibration and translated that vibration into the words and formulas that became the Vedas. The concept of Daivavak, divine speech, describes the creative process as a descent of cosmic information into human consciousness, mediated by a receptive faculty that the traditions call intuition, and that the neuroscience is now beginning to map. The Judeo-Christian tradition describes the same process through the concept of Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the divine breath or wind that inspires prophets, artists, and visionaries. The Hebrew word for prophet Navi comes from a root meaning to bubble up or to pour forth, suggesting that prophetic speech is not produced by the prophet but flows through the prophet from a source that is above and beyond the prophet's own mind. David did not compose the Psalms. The Spirit composed the Psalms through David. Bezalel, the artisan who built the tabernacle, was filled with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills. The creative skill was not Bezalel's own. It was the Spirit's flowing through Bezalel, using Bezalel as an instrument, producing through Bezalel's hands what Bezalel's mind alone could not have conceived. The convergence is remarkable. Every tradition, Greek, Hindu, Islamic, Judeo-Christian describes creativity as reception rather than production. The creative idea does not originate in the human mind. It arrives in the human mind from a muse, from a goddess, from God, from the cosmic order, from a dimension of reality that the individual consciousness can access but does not create. The human creator is not the source. The human creator is the channel, and the quality of the channel, its openness, its receptivity, its capacity to receive without distorting, determines the quality of the creation. This is the question that the neuroscience of creativity has been investigating for the last 3 decades, and the findings are remarkably consistent with the tradition's descriptions. Because when neuroscientists look at the creative brain, when they scan the brains of artists, musicians, scientists, writers, and inventors during moments of creative breakthrough, they do not find what they expected to find. They do not find a creativity center, a specific brain region that produces creative ideas the way Broca's area produces speech. They find something stranger, something more distributed, something that looks less like a production process and more like a reception process. They find the default mode network. The default mode network, the DMN, is the brain system that activates when you are not focused on any specific task. When you are daydreaming, when your mind is wandering, when you are staring out the window without thinking about anything in particular, when you are in the shower, in the car, falling asleep, waking up in the liminal, unfocused, task-free states that occupy approximately half of your waking life. The DMN was discovered by Marcus Rachel at Washington University in 2001, and its discovery was initially puzzling because the DMN does not activate during any specific cognitive task. It activates during the absence of specific cognitive tasks. It is the brain's resting state, the activity that the brain defaults to when it is not doing anything else. Hence the name default mode network. But the DMN is not resting. It is working furiously, intensively, consuming as much metabolic energy as the most demanding cognitive tasks. The DMN is doing something. But what? Reichel and subsequent researchers have identified the DMN's primary functions: self-referential processing, thinking about yourself; social cognition, thinking about other people; mental time travel, remembering the past and imagining the future; and crucially for this investigation, spontaneous thought generation. The DMN generates thoughts that you did not intend to think. It produces ideas that you did not decide to produce. It creates associations, connections, and combinations that the focused, task-oriented, deliberately reasoning mind does not create. Roger Beaty, a neuroscientist at Penn State, published a landmark study in 2018 using network neuroscience to map the brain's creative architecture. Beaty found that highly creative individuals show a distinctive pattern of functional connectivity, stronger connections between the DMN, the executive control network, which manages deliberate thought and evaluation, and the salience network, which detects relevance and signals when something important has emerged from the unconscious. The 3 networks, typically antagonistic, typically suppressing each other, cooperate in the creative brain. The DMN generates the raw material, the salience network detects the promising ideas among the noise, and the executive network evaluates, refines, and develops the ideas that the salience network has flagged. Creativity is not the product of one network. It is the product of a collaboration between networks, a collaboration that the typical brain suppresses but that the creative brain facilitates. The DMN is the brain's free association engine, the neural system that produces the unbidden thoughts, the unexpected connections, the surprising juxtapositions that are the raw material of creative insight. Rex Jung, a neuropsychologist at the University of New Mexico, has conducted some of the most comprehensive studies of the creative brain, and his findings challenge the popular assumption that creativity is a right brain phenomenon. Jung found that creativity does not live in one hemisphere or one brain region. It lives in the connections between regions in the capacity of the brain to form novel associations between ideas, concepts, and memories that are stored in different locations and that are not normally connected. The creative brain is not a brain with a bigger right hemisphere. It is a brain with more white matter, more myelinated connections between distant brain regions, more neural highways linking areas that are normally separate, more capacity for what the neuroscientist Arne Dietrich calls transient hypofrontality, a concept that Jung has extensively studied in the context of creativity. Transient hypofrontality is the temporary reduction of prefrontal cortex activity that allows the censoring, editing, evaluating functions of the executive brain to step back and let the DMN's spontaneous associations flow without inhibition. This is where the neuroscience begins to converge with the tradition's descriptions. The traditions say, creative ideas come from a source that is beyond the deliberate, reasoning mind. The neuroscience says, creative ideas come from the default mode network, a brain system that operates below and beyond the deliberate, reasoning mind. The traditions say, the creative state requires the reduction of the ego's control, the quieting of the rational mind, the surrender of deliberate intention, the opening of a channel that the ego's noise normally blocks. The neuroscience says, the creative state requires transient hypofrontality, the temporary reduction of prefrontal control, the quieting of the executive functions, the opening of the neural pathways that prefrontal censoring normally blocks. The traditions say, the creative idea arrives fully formed, without the step-by-step reasoning that the conscious mind uses. The neuroscience says, the DMN generates ideas through spontaneous association rather than through deliberate reasoning, producing connections that arrive in consciousness already formed, without the conscious mind having participated in their formation. The process by which a creative insight moves from the unconscious to the conscious mind has been studied most intensively by Mark Beeman and John Kunios, neuroscientists who have mapped the aha moment, the instant of creative insight with EEG and fMRI. Beeman and Kunios found that the aha moment is preceded by a specific neural signature, a burst of alpha wave activity over the right visual cortex, beginning approximately 1.5 seconds before the insight reaches consciousness. The alpha burst represents a brief period of sensory gating, the brain temporarily shutting down visual processing, turning attention inward, blocking external input so that the faint signal of the emerging insight is not drowned out by the noise of sensory data. The brain is creating silence, internal silence, sensory silence, so that the whisper of the insight can be heard. And then approximately 300 milliseconds before the insight reaches consciousness, a burst of gamma wave activity erupts in the right anterior temporal lobe. The gamma burst is the insight itself, the moment of neural binding when distant, previously unconnected representations are suddenly linked, when the pattern that the DMN has been assembling in the unconscious suddenly coheres into a unified perception that crosses the threshold into awareness. The preparation for the insight is equally revealing. Kunios found that the brains of people who tend to solve problems through insight through the aha moment, rather than through methodical analysis, show a distinctive resting state pattern, higher baseline activity in the right hemisphere, stronger connectivity between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, and a characteristic pattern of alpha activity over the visual cortex that Kunios interprets as a habitual tendency to direct attention inward rather than outward. The insight-prone brain is, at rest, already configured for reception, already oriented toward the internal, already listening to the DMN's spontaneous associations, already primed to detect the faint signal of the emerging insight against the background noise of ordinary cognition. The insight does not build gradually. It appears suddenly in a burst of gamma activity that lights up the temporal lobe like a lightning flash, binding the disparate elements into a unified whole and delivering the result to consciousness as a fait accompli. The conscious mind did not produce the insight. The conscious mind received the insight from the unconscious processing of the DMN, delivered through the gamma burst, arriving in awareness already formed, already coherent, already recognized as correct. The incubation effect, one of the most robustly replicated findings in creativity research, provides additional evidence that the unconscious mind drives the creative process. The incubation effect is the observation that creative problems are often solved not during active work on the problem, but during breaks, during sleep, during walks, during showers, during the unfocused, task-free periods when the conscious mind is occupied with something else. Ap Dijksterhuis at Radboud University, whose unconscious thought theory we explored in the subconscious investigation, demonstrated that complex decisions and creative problems benefit from a period of unconscious incubation. Participants who were distracted after being given a complex problem, who were prevented from consciously thinking about the problem for a period of time, produced better solutions than participants who worked on the problem continuously. The unconscious mind continued to work on the problem during the distraction period, assembling associations, testing combinations, evaluating possibilities without any conscious awareness or deliberate intention. The solution emerged after the incubation period, arriving in consciousness as a spontaneous insight rather than as the product of deliberate reasoning. This is why so many creative breakthroughs occur in the shower, during walks, in the moments between sleeping and waking. The shower is an incubation chamber. The walk is an incubation walk. The hypnagogic state is an incubation state. The conscious mind is disengaged. The prefrontal cortex is relaxed. The DMN is free to operate without interference. And the solution assembled by the unconscious, delivered by the gamma burst, received by the conscious mind as a gift from an unknown source appears. The parallel to the tradition's descriptions is structural. The Muse delivers the poem, the DMN delivers the insight. The goddess shows Ramanujan the formula. The gamma burst shows the solver the solution. The divine breath inspires the prophet. The alpha-gamma sequence opens the channel and transmits the signal. The vocabulary is different. The mechanism may be the same, a process in which creative ideas are generated below the threshold of consciousness, assembled by a neural system that operates independently of deliberate intention, and delivered to awareness through a specific neural event that the conscious mind experiences as reception rather than production. But the neuroscience raises a question that it cannot answer, a question that connects directly to everything we have explored across these investigations. If the DMN generates creative ideas through spontaneous association, where do the associations come from? The obvious answer is memory. The DMN recombines stored memories, learned concepts, and acquired knowledge into novel configurations. And this is certainly part of the answer. Most creative ideas are recombinations of existing knowledge, but some creative ideas are not. Ramanujan's formulas were not recombinations of mathematics he had learned. Many of them involved concepts that had not yet been developed. Kekulé's ring structure was not a recombination of known chemical structures. It was a genuinely new structural concept that contradicted the prevailing assumptions of organic chemistry. Tesla's alternating current system was not a recombination of existing electrical technologies. It was a fundamentally new approach that the existing paradigm could not have generated through recombination alone. The phenomenon of acquired savant syndrome adds a dimension that pushes the question even further beyond the boundaries of conventional neuroscience. Acquired savant syndrome is the condition in which an ordinary person with no special talent or training suddenly develops extraordinary creative abilities following brain damage. Derek Amato, a Denver man with no musical training, hit his head on the bottom of a swimming pool in 2006, and woke up, able to play the piano with professional level skill. He had never played before. He had never taken a lesson. He sat at a piano, and his fingers played, producing complex, emotionally rich, technically proficient compositions that he experienced as flowing through him rather than from him. Alonzo Clemens, a man with severe cognitive impairment following a childhood head injury, can sculpt anatomically perfect animal figures from memory after a single glance at the animal, working at extraordinary speed with no training. Jason Padgett, a furniture salesman in Tacoma who was assaulted outside a bar, woke up seeing geometric patterns in everything, in water, in trees, in the curvature of space, in the mathematical structures that underlie physical reality. He had no mathematical training. He now draws complex fractals by hand and has been studied by neuroscientists who confirmed that his perception of geometric structure is mathematically accurate. The acquired savant cases are profoundly challenging for the practice savant, conventional model of creativity. If creativity is the recombination of learned skills and stored memories, then a person with no musical training should not be able to play the piano after a head injury. There are no musical memories to recombine. There are no learned skills to reorganize. The ability appears from nowhere, or, more precisely, from somewhere that the brain damage has opened access to. The damage removes a barrier, it breaks a filter, and the ability which was always potentially available, but which the intact brain's filtering system was suppressing, floods in. This is the filter theory applied to creativity, the same filter theory we developed in the OBE investigation, applied not to consciousness in general but to creative ability in particular. The brain does not produce creativity, it filters creativity. And when the filter is damaged by head injury, by disease, by the specific forms of neural reorganization that acquired savant syndrome involves the creativity that was always available, always present, always waiting behind the filter, pours through. Where do genuinely novel ideas come from? Ideas that are not merely new combinations of old elements but that introduce something that was not present in any of the elements that were combined. The neuroscience does not have an answer. The DMN generates associations, but the source of the raw material that the DMN associates remains unclear. Memory accounts for much of it, but memory does not account for all of it. And the gap between what memory provides and what the creative mind produces, is the gap that the traditions fill with the muse, with the goddess, with the divine breath, with the cosmic information field that the contemplative traditions have been accessing for millennia, and that the quantum framework may, for the first time, begin to describe in the language of physics. The next part of this investigation will enter the quantum domain, where the implicate order, the quantum vacuum, and the non-local nature of information provide a framework for understanding how creative ideas might arrive from beyond the individual mind's stored memories. Because the traditions did not merely assert that creativity comes from a divine source, they described the mechanism, the channel, the faculty, the practice that opens the connection between the individual mind and the cosmic information field. And the mechanism they described maps, with surprising precision, onto the neuroscience of the default mode network, the physics of non-local information, and the quantum framework of consciousness that we have been building across these investigations. The neuroscience documents what happens in the brain during creative insight. The default mode network generates associations. The executive network evaluates them. The salience network selects the promising ones. The three networks synchronize, and the eureka moment arrives complete, whole, seemingly from nowhere. But the neuroscience does not answer the deeper question. Where does the content come from? The DMN combines existing knowledge in novel ways, but some creative insights appear to contain knowledge that the creator did not possess. Ramanujan's formulas exceeded the frontier of known mathematics. Kekulé's Ouroboros vision delivered a molecular structure that no chemist had conceived. Tesla's visualizations produced engineering designs of a precision that exceeded what deliberate calculation could achieve. The savant who has never studied mathematics perceives geometric structures that trained mathematicians require years to comprehend. The content arrives from somewhere, and the somewhere is not the individual brain's stored memories recombined in novel ways. It is something deeper, something wider, something that the traditions call the Muse, God, the collective unconscious, the Akashic field, and that the quantum physics may, for the first time in the history of science, be able to describe in physical terms. David Bohm's implicate order is the most natural framework for understanding creative insight as access to a deeper informational reality. We have encountered the implicate order in every investigation we have conducted. It is the theoretical structure that keeps returning because it keeps being relevant. In the implicate order, everything is enfolded into everything else. Every piece of information that has ever existed, every mathematical relationship, every physical law, every chemical structure, every biological form, every melody, every image, every idea is enfolded into the deep structure of reality, available for unfolding when the conditions are right. The explicate order, the surface reality of distinct objects, separate events, and sequential time, is a projection from the implicate order, and the projection is partial. The explicate order unfolds only a fraction of the implicate order's total informational content at any given moment. The rest remains enfolded, present, available, but not currently expressed. Creative insight, in Bohm's framework, is the unfolding of information from the implicate order into the explicate order through the medium of the individual mind. The information was always there, enfolded, latent, waiting for a mind that was prepared to receive it. Ramanujan's mathematical formulas were enfolded in the implicate order, not because someone put them there, but because mathematical relationships are features of the informational structure of reality, and the implicate order contains all informational structures. Kekulé's benzene ring was enfolded in the implicate order, not because a designer encoded it, but because the hexagonal arrangement of carbon atoms is a physical possibility that exists in the space of all possible molecular configurations, and the implicate order contains all possibilities. The creative genius does not invent. The creative genius perceives, perceiving, through some capacity that the normal mind does not exercise, the enfolded information that is available for unfolding, but that requires a receptive mind to unfold into conscious awareness. Bohm himself described creativity in exactly these terms. In his book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, Bohm argued that creative thought is not the mechanical combination of existing elements. It is a creative perception, a direct apprehension of new order, a seeing of relationships that were not visible before, a perception of the implicate order's structure that the ordinary mind, trapped in the explicate order's fragmented view, cannot achieve. The creative mind does not merely think differently, it perceives differently, perceiving the deeper order that underlies the surface disorder, perceiving the connections that the analytical mind's fragmented approach cannot see, perceiving the whole that is enfolded in every part. Bohm's collaboration with Jiddu Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher who spent decades investigating the nature of thought and perception, produced a remarkable convergence between the physicist's and the philosopher's understanding of creativity. Krishnamurti argued that true creativity is not the activity of thought, not the combination, the recombination, the modification of existing knowledge. True creativity is the cessation of thought, the moment when the known stops and the unknown begins, when the mind's accumulated knowledge falls silent and something genuinely new emerges from the silence. Bohm recognized in Krishnamurti's description the same structure he had identified in the implicate order. The creative act is the transition from the explicate, the known, the accumulated, the recombined, to the implicate, the unknown, the enfolded, the genuinely new. Bohm and Krishnamurti conducted a series of public dialogues filmed, transcribed, and published, in which the physicist and the philosopher explored the nature of thought, creativity, and perception. In one exchange, Krishnamurti asks, "Can the mind be free of the known?" Bohm responds, "If the mind is always operating from the known, it can only produce modifications of the known. It cannot produce something genuinely new." Krishnamurti presses, "So the new can only arise when the known is silent?" Bohm agrees. The new arises from a different order, an order that is not contained in the known, that is not derivable from the known, that must be perceived directly rather than constructed logically. This exchange captures the essence of the quantum creativity framework. The known is the explicate order, the surface reality of accumulated knowledge, stored memories, learned associations. The different order is the implicate order, the deeper reality of enfolded information, non-local correlations, the total informational content of the universe. And the transition from the known to the different order requires not more thinking but less, not more effort but more openness, not more knowledge but more emptiness, not more noise but more silence. This connects directly to the neuroscience of the DMN. The default mode network activates when the task-positive network, the analytical, effortful, knowledge-based processing system, deactivates. The creative insight arrives when you stop trying. The eureka moment comes when the conscious mind releases its grip on the problem and allows the unconscious, the DMN, the associative engine, the part of the mind that is connected to the deeper informational structures, to operate without constraint. Bohm and Krishnamurti describe this philosophically. The neuroscience describes it neurologically. And the description is the same. Creativity requires the cessation of the known, the quieting of the analytical mind, the silencing of the accumulated knowledge, the opening of a space in which the genuinely new can emerge from the deeper order that the ordinary mind's activity normally conceals. The quantum vacuum provides the physical substrate for the implicate order's informational content, and therefore for the reservoir from which creative insight may be drawn. As we established in the information investigation, the quantum vacuum is not empty. It contains zero-point energy, the irreducible minimum of energy that quantum mechanics guarantees is present even in the absence of all matter and all radiation. It contains virtual particles, particle-antiparticle pairs, that flash into existence and annihilate within the time allowed by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And it contains, if the holographic principle is correct, the complete information content of the universe encoded on the boundary of space-time, projected into the three-dimensional bulk as the physical reality we experience. The quantum vacuum is the physical candidate for the Akashic field, the cosmic information reservoir that the Hindu tradition describes as containing the complete record of every event, every thought, every possibility that has ever existed or could ever exist. The vacuum is not a metaphor for the Akashic field. It is the physical system that the Akashic field could be, a physical system that contains information, that is non-local, that is accessible from any point in space-time, and that is comprehensive in its informational content. The informational capacity of the quantum vacuum is staggering. John Wheeler calculated that the energy density of the quantum vacuum, the zero-point energy contained in every cubic centimeter of empty space, is approximately 10 to the 94th power grams per cubic centimeter. This is a number so large that it exceeds the total mass energy of the observable universe by many orders of magnitude. The vacuum contains more energy, and therefore, through the equivalence of energy and information established by Landauer's principle, more information than all the matter in the universe combined. If even a fraction of this information is accessible to biological systems, If the brain's quantum processes can tap into even an infinitesimal portion of the vacuum's informational content, then the reservoir from which creative insight could be drawn is, for all practical purposes, infinite. The physicist Erwin Laszlo, building on the work of Bohm, Pribram, and the holographic principle, has proposed that the quantum vacuum functions as a cosmic information field that he calls the Akashic field, explicitly connecting the physics to the Hindu concept of the Akashic records. Laszlo argues that the vacuum preserves the information of every event that has ever occurred, every quantum measurement, every conscious observation, every creative act, and that this preserved information is accessible, in principle, to any system that has the quantum coherence to access it. The vacuum is the universe's hard drive, and the creative insight is a read operation, a retrieval of information from the cosmic database through the quantum channel that connects the individual brain to the universal field. If creative insight is the reception of information from the quantum vacuum, from the implicate order, from the Akashic field, then the mechanism of reception becomes the central question. How does the individual mind access information from a non-local quantum field? The answer may involve the same quantum processes that we have explored throughout these investigations: quantum coherence in microtubules, non-local correlations between the brain and the vacuum, and the filter theory of consciousness. The Penrose-Hameroff-Ochoa theory proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules, the crystalline protein structures within neurons. Each moment of conscious experience corresponds to an objective reduction event, a self-collapse of the quantum superposition in the microtubules, determined by quantum gravity and connected to the Planck scale geometry of space-time. The Ochoa process is not merely a brain process. It is a space-time process connecting the microtubules to the deepest structure of physical reality, to the Planck scale foam, to the quantum vacuum itself. And this connection between the microtubules and the vacuum may be the channel through which creative information reaches the conscious mind. The biological plausibility of this connection has been strengthened by recent experimental findings. Anirban Bandyopadhyay, the physicist at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, whose work we have encountered in multiple investigations, has demonstrated that individual microtubules sustain quantum resonances at specific frequencies in the megahertz and gigahertz ranges. The resonances are not thermal noise. They are organized, frequency-specific, and consistent with the quantum coherence that the Ochoa theory predicts. And the resonances are sensitive to anesthetic agents. The same agents that suppress consciousness also suppress the microtubule resonances, establishing a correlation between quantum coherence in microtubules and the presence of conscious awareness. If microtubule resonances are the biological substrate of consciousness, and if the resonances connect to the Planck scale geometry through quantum gravitational effects, then the microtubules are not merely neural support structures. They are quantum antennae, biological receivers tuned to the frequencies of the quantum vacuum, capable of accessing information that is encoded in the deepest structure of physical reality. And the creative insight is the moment when the antenna receives a signal, a specific piece of information from the vacuum, delivered through the quantum channel, collapsed into a definite neural state through the Ochoa process, and experienced by the conscious mind as a sudden, complete, apparently sourceless idea. Hameroff has described this channel explicitly. He proposes that the quantum computations in microtubules are not limited to the information stored in the brain. They access through quantum coherence, through non-local correlations, through the connection to the Planck scale geometry information that is encoded in the quantum vacuum itself. The microtubules are not merely processors of stored data. They are receivers antennae that tune into the quantum vacuum's informational content and that deliver, through the Ochoa collapse, specific information from the vacuum into conscious awareness. The creative insight is the auteur event in which the collapse delivers information from the vacuum that the brain's stored knowledge did not contain information that is genuinely new, genuinely from outside the individual mind, genuinely from the deeper informational structure of reality. This is speculative. It must be stated clearly. The mechanism by which microtubules might access vacuum information has not been experimentally demonstrated. The auteur theory itself remains controversial, accepted by some physicists and neuroscientists, rejected by others, and not yet confirmed by the kind of definitive experimental evidence that would settle the debate. But the speculation is physically coherent. It is consistent with the established physics of quantum mechanics, with the established biology of microtubules, and with the established phenomenology of creative insight, and it provides a specific, testable mechanism for the tradition's claim that creative inspiration comes from beyond the individual mind, a mechanism grounded in physics rather than mythology. Henry Stapp's process 1 provides another quantum mechanism for creative insight. In Stapp's framework, consciousness interacts with the brain through the choice of which quantum template to attend to. The brain generates a superposition of possible neural states, a quantum menu of templates, each representing a different thought, a different perception, a different idea. And consciousness through process 1 selects one template from the superposition, collapsing it into a definite neural state, making one thought actual and the others potential. In ordinary cognition, the templates are generated from the brain's stored knowledge, from memories, from learned associations, from the habitual patterns that prior experience has deposited. But in creative cognition, the templates may include elements that are not derived from stored knowledge, elements that are generated by the brain's quantum connection to the vacuum, elements that represent genuinely new information that has not been learned or experienced, but that has been accessed through the non-local quantum correlations that connect the brain to the implicate order, creative process. 1 is the selection of a template that contains vacuum-derived information, a template that the brain's classical processing could not have generated from its stored data, a template that represents a genuine insight from beyond the individual mind. The quantum Zeno effect adds a crucial dimension to the quantum creativity framework. As we explored in the free will and fear investigations, the Zeno effect is the quantum principle that sustained attention stabilizes a quantum state, preventing it from evolving, holding it in place against the natural tendency to decohere. In the context of creativity, the Zeno effect explains two phenomena that every creative person recognizes. First, the fragility of creative insight. The eureka moment is fleeting if you do not attend to it immediately. If you do not capture it in words or notes or sketches, it dissolves. The insight decohere, the quantum state that delivered the information from the vacuum, evolves into another state. The template shifts. The information is lost. Every writer knows the experience of having a brilliant idea in the shower and forgetting it by the time they reach their desk. Every musician knows the experience of hearing a melody in their head and losing it before they can write it down. Samuel Taylor Coleridge reported that his poem, Kubla Khan, arrived complete during an opium-influenced dream, hundreds of lines of verse, fully formed, waiting only to be transcribed. Coleridge began writing furiously upon waking and had recorded 54 lines when he was interrupted by a person on business from Porlock. When the visitor left and Coleridge returned to his desk, the poem was gone, dissolved, vanished, irrecoverable. The quantum state had decohered. The information from the vacuum had been lost, and one of the greatest poems in the English language remains a fragment 54 lines of what Coleridge described as a much longer work. The rest destroyed, not by fire or flood, but by the simple interruption of attention. that allowed the quantum state to evolve beyond recovery. Beethoven carried a notebook everywhere, not because he was disciplined, but because he was desperate. The ideas arrived without warning and disappeared without mercy. If he did not capture them immediately in whatever notation he could manage, on whatever surface was available, they were gone forever. The notebook was Beethoven's Zeno device, his technology for stabilizing the fragile quantum states that delivered his music from the implicate order into his conscious mind. The insight is a quantum state fragile, temporary, vulnerable to decoherence. And the only way to preserve it is attention, the sustained observation that the Zeno effect provides, the focused awareness that holds the quantum state in place long enough for the conscious mind to register it, evaluate it, and encode it in a stable form. Second, the importance of preparation. The creative insight does not arrive randomly. It arrives in minds that are prepared, minds that have spent hours, days, weeks, years immersed in the problem, accumulating the knowledge and the questions that create the conditions for the insight to occur. Pasteur's observation, "Chance favors the prepared mind," is the Zeno effect applied to creative preparation. The prepared mind has been attending to the problem for so long that the relevant quantum states have been stabilized through Zeno observation. The templates related to the problem have been held in the brain's quantum superposition through sustained attention. And when the insight arrives, when the vacuum delivers the missing piece through the non-local quantum connection, the prepared mind recognizes it immediately, selects it through process 1, and stabilizes it through continued Zeno attention. The unprepared mind, the mind that has not spent weeks immersed in the problem, would not recognize the insight, even if it arrived. The template would be generated and would decohere before the unprepared mind could identify it as relevant. The non-locality of quantum mechanics explains how creative insight can transcend the individual mind's knowledge. Boundaries. Non-locality, the property demonstrated by Bell's theorem and the 2022 Nobel Prize experiments, means that quantum systems can be correlated across any distance without signal transmission. If the brain's microtubules are quantum correlated with the vacuum, and if the vacuum contains the informational content of the universe, then the brain has access, in principle, to any information in the universe, not through signal transmission, not through sensory channels, not through any mechanism that classical physics can describe. Through quantum correlation, the same instantaneous, non-local, non-signaling connection that links entangled particles across the diameter of the galaxy. This is the physics of Ramanujan's mathematics. The formulas that arrived in his dreams were not transmitted from a remote mathematician through a sensory channel. They were accessed through the non-local quantum connection between Ramanujan's microtubules and the quantum vacuum in which the mathematical relationships are encoded. The mathematics was always there, enfolded in the implicate order, encoded in the vacuum, available to any mind that was prepared to receive it and that had the quantum coherence to access it. Ramanujan's mind had the preparation. He was immersed in mathematics from childhood. His attention was sustained. His templates were stabilized by years of Zeno observation. And Ramanujan's mind may have had the coherence, the quantum coherence in his microtubules that enabled the non-local connection, the biological antenna tuned to the vacuum's mathematical frequencies. The goddess Namagiri was his cultural framework for describing a quantum process that his culture did not have the vocabulary to articulate. The same analysis applies to every historical case of apparently anomalous creative insight. Mozart's music arriving complete, whole, from a source he could not identify, may have been accessed from the vacuum's informational content through the quantum coherence of his uniquely gifted brain. Tesla's visualizations, precise enough to build working machines from, may have been received from the implicate order through a quantum channel that Tesla's extraordinary powers of concentration maintained with unusual strength. The acquired savant Jason Padgett, seeing mathematical structures in the physical world after brain damage removed his left hemisphere filter, may have gained access to the vacuum's mathematical content through the disinhibition of quantum processes that the normal brain keeps suppressed. The common thread across all these cases is the relationship between filtration and creativity. The filter blocks vacuum information. The relaxation of the filter admits vacuum information. And the creative insight is the vacuum information arriving in conscious awareness, perceived by the recipient as coming from outside, experienced as received rather than produced, attributed to the Muse, or to God, or to the goddess Namagiri, because the recipient recognizes correctly that the information did not come from their own stored knowledge. The Jung-Pauli collaboration, which we explored in the subconscious investigation and the synchronicity investigation, provides the most rigorous theoretical framework for understanding the relationship between the individual unconscious and the implicate order. Jung's collective unconscious is the psychological expression of the implicate order, the shared informational field that underlies all individual psyches, containing the archetypes, the universal patterns, the structural relationships that appear in dreams, in myths, in creative visions, and in scientific insights across every culture and every era. Pauli's quantum mechanics is the physical expression of the same underlying reality, the mathematical structure of the informational field that Jung described psychologically and that Bohm described philosophically. And the creative insight, the moment when a genuinely new idea emerges from the collective unconscious into the individual mind, is the moment when the implicate order unfolds a new piece of information through the quantum channel that connects the individual brain to the universal field. Pauli himself experienced this directly. His dreams, which Jung analyzed over many years, contain mathematical symbols, physical insights, and structural patterns that anticipated his own later discoveries in physics. The dreams accessed information from the collective unconscious that Pauli's waking mind had not yet formulated information that was present in the implicate order, available for unfolding, waiting for a mind that was prepared to receive it. Pauli's preparation was his decades of immersion in physics. His access was his dream state, the natural relaxation of the filter that sleep provides, and his insight was the unfolding of implicate information into explicate awareness, the creative act described simultaneously in the language of physics and the language of depth psychology. The connection between altered states of consciousness and creative insight finds its quantum explanation in the filter theory. The brain's normal filtering system, the default mode network's self-referential processing, the prefrontal cortex's executive control, the analytical mind's logical constraints filters the information that reaches conscious awareness. The filter admits information from the senses and from stored memory. It blocks information from the quantum vacuum because vacuum information is not useful for biological survival, because the organism's immediate needs are better served by sensory data than by abstract mathematical relationships or novel molecular structures. The filter is adaptive, it is evolved, it serves the organism's survival, but the filter can be relaxed. Sleep relaxes it, and the dreams that arrive during sleep contain creative insights that waking cognition cannot produce. Meditation relaxes it, and the insights that arrive during deep practice contain perceptions that ordinary consciousness cannot access. Psychedelics relax it, and the expanded consciousness that results contains knowledge and vision that the normal mind cannot reach. And the incubation period relaxes it, the period of non-effort, of walking and showering and doing nothing, during which the analytical mind releases its grip and the filter thins enough for vacuum information to reach conscious awareness. The creative genius may be an individual whose filter is naturally thinner than average, and mine, individual whose brain admits more information from the quantum vacuum, whose microtubules maintain higher coherence, whose quantum connection to the implicate order is stronger. This would explain the consistent reports of creative geniuses across history. The sense that the creative content arrives from outside, the inability to identify the source, the feeling of being a channel rather than a creator. The genius is not smarter than the ordinary person in the sense of having more computational power. The genius is more open, more permeable to the information that the vacuum contains, more receptive to the templates that the quantum connection delivers, more able to perceive the implicate orders in folded content and unfold it into conscious, communicable form. And this would explain the equally consistent reports that the creative state is fragile, that the insight dissolves when the analytical mind reasserts itself, that the creative flow stops when the filter tightens, that the genius produces their best work in states of relaxation, absorption, and flow rather than in states of effort, concentration, and deliberate control. The filter is the enemy of creativity. The analytical mind, with its logical constraints and its insistence on processing only information from known sources, blocks the very channel through which genuinely new information arrives. And the practices that relax the filter, meditation, walking, dreaming, musical absorption, the doing nothing that the DMN requires, are not laziness. They are the creative process itself, the opening of the quantum channel. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who coined the concept of flow, described the flow state as the optimal state for creative performance, complete absorption in the activity, loss of self-consciousness, distortion of time perception, effortless action, and intrinsic motivation. The flow state is characterized by a specific neural signature: reduced prefrontal activity, the transient hypofrontality described by Arne Dietrich, reduced default mode network, self-referential processing, and enhanced connectivity between the regions involved in the specific creative task. The flow state is the filter at its thinnest during waking activity, the analytical mind quieted, the self-consciousness dissolved, the logical constraints loosened, and the creative channel opened to its maximum waking aperture. Every creative professional recognizes the flow state and recognizes that it cannot be forced. You cannot will yourself into flow. You can only create the conditions that favor its emergence: clear goals, immediate feedback, an optimal balance between challenge and skill, and the elimination of distractions. These conditions are, in the quantum framework, the conditions that optimize the quantum channel, that stabilize the relevant templates through Zeno attention, that relax the filter through reduced self-referential processing, and that open the connection to the vacuum through enhanced neural coherence. The flow state is the quantum creativity channel operating at peak efficiency during waking consciousness, the closest the waking mind comes to the filter relaxation that sleep and meditation provide. The creative process, in the quantum framework, is not a talent. It is a state of consciousness in which the filter is thin, the channel is open, the templates are stabilized, and the vacuum's informational content can reach the conscious mind. And the state can be cultivated through the practices that the traditions prescribe and that the neuroscience confirms: meditation, incubation, relaxation, absorption, silence, solitude, and the sustained attention to the domain that creates the preparation without which the vacuum's delivery cannot be recognized. The creative act is the opening of the quantum channel, the thinning of the filter, the creation of the conditions under which the implicate orders in folded information can unfold into the mind of the individual who is prepared to receive it. The traditions understood this, and they built their creative technologies around it. The next part of this investigation will enter the traditions fully, hearing their descriptions of how creative inspiration is cultivated, how the channel is opened, how the filter is relaxed, and how the individual mind becomes a vessel for the information that the universe contains. Because the traditions did not merely describe creative inspiration as divine, they prescribe practices for cultivating it. practices that are structurally identical to the conditions that the neuroscience identifies as optimal for creative insight, and that the quantum framework identifies as optimal for vacuum information reception. The convergence, as we will see, is too precise to be coincidental. The traditions did not wait for neuroscience to discover the default mode network. They did not wait for quantum physics to describe the implicate order. They did not wait for Csikszentmihalyi to name the flow state, or for Beaty to map the creative brain's connectivity. They discovered the creative process through direct experience, through millennia of contemplative practice, artistic discipline, and the sustained observation of what happens when the mind quiets and the deeper frequencies of reality become audible. And they described what they found with a precision that the neuroscience is now confirming and that the quantum framework is now explaining. The Islamic tradition provides the most detailed phenomenological account of creative inspiration in any Abrahamic religion, and the account begins with the most consequential creative event in Islamic history, the revelation of the Quran. The Quran was not composed by Muhammad. It was received transmitted from the divine source through the angel Jibreel over a period of 23 years, in fragments, in specific contexts, in response to specific circumstances. And the reception was not a gentle whisper. It was a physiological event of overwhelming intensity. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, described the process. Sometimes it comes to him like the ringing of a bell, and that is the hardest on him. Then it passes from him, and he has understood what was said. And sometimes the angel comes to him in the form of a man and speaks to him, and he understands what he says. The companions reported that during revelation, Muhammad's face would change color. Sweat would pour from his forehead, even on cold days. His body would become heavy, so heavy that if he was sitting on a camel, the camel would kneel under the sudden weight, and he would enter a state of altered consciousness that was visibly different from his normal waking state. The tradition distinguishes between two types of inspiration. Wahi, direct revelation, is reserved for prophets. It is the unmediated transmission of divine speech, word for word, letter for letter, from God through the angelic intermediary to the human recipient. The Quran is Wahi, ilham. Inspiration is available to all believers. It is the quieter, subtler form of divine guidance that arrives through intuition, through dreams, through the sudden clarity that descends upon the heart when the conditions are right. Ilham is not infallible, unlike Wahi. It requires verification against scripture and reason, but it is real, a genuine transmission of guidance from the divine source to the human mind, available to anyone who cultivates the receptive conditions. The conditions that the Islamic tradition prescribes for receiving ilham are structurally identical to the conditions that the neuroscience identifies as optimal for creative insight. Dhikr, the repetitive remembrance of God through the rhythmic chanting of divine names, occupies the surface attention while freeing the deeper processing for reception. This is the Islamic equivalent of the shower insight. The body and the surface mind are occupied with a rhythmic, repetitive activity, while the DMN equivalent processing operates freely in the background. Muraqabah, contemplative watchfulness, is the systematic quieting of the analytical mind, the withdrawal of attention from external stimuli, the turning of awareness inward toward the heart center. This is the Islamic equivalent of meditation, the reduction of sensory input, the thinning of the filter, the creation of the receptive silence in which inspiration can be heard. And tawakkul, trust in God, surrender of outcomes, is the release of the ego's grip on the creative process, the abandonment of the desire to control the result, the opening of the channel through the act of spiritual surrender. This is the Islamic equivalent of the incubation period, the letting go that allows the unconscious processing to operate without the interference of the conscious mind's anxious monitoring. The Sufi tradition Islam's contemplative dimension developed the most sophisticated technology for cultivating creative inspiration in the Islamic world. The great Sufi poets Rumi, Hafiz, Ibn Arabi, Attar did not write poetry in the way that modern poets write. They received it in states of ecstasy, in the whirling ceremony of the Sema, in the deep silence of Khalwa, spiritual retreat, in the overwhelming presence of divine love that the Sufi tradition calls ishq. Rumi's Masnavi, one of the longest and most celebrated poems in world literature, over 25,000 couplets, was reportedly dictated in states of ecstatic inspiration, often while Rumi was walking, spinning, or in conversation with his beloved companion, Shamsi Tabrizi. The poetry poured through him, not from him. The distinction is essential. The Sufi poet is not the author. The Sufi poet is the reed flute, the hollow instrument through which the divine breath flows, producing music that the instrument did not compose and cannot claim. Rumi says this explicitly. I am a flute through which the beloved breathes. The music is not mine. The creative act is an act of emptying. The Sufi tradition prescribes specific practices for achieving this emptiness. Khalwa, spiritual retreat, involves withdrawing from society for 40 days, mirroring the 40-day retreats of Jesus in the desert, Moses on Mount Sinai, and the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. Fasting, reducing sleep, maintaining continuous dhikr, and progressively stripping away every attachment, every desire, every thought that the ego generates. The 40 days are a systematic program of filter removal, each day quieter than the last, each layer of the ego's noise peeled away, each distraction eliminated, until what remains is the bare, transparent awareness that the Sufi tradition calls the polished heart. And the polished heart is the perfect receiver, the flute emptied of obstruction, the mirror cleared of tarnish, the channel open to its maximum capacity for receiving the divine breath that the tradition identifies as the source of all genuine creativity. The Sufi musical tradition, particularly the reed flute that is the emblematic instrument of the Mevlevi order, embodies this understanding physically. The ney is a hollow reed. Its music is not produced by the reed. It is produced by the breath that passes through the reed. The quality of the music depends not on the reed's complexity but on its emptiness, on the completeness of the hollowing, on the smoothness of the internal channel, on the absence of obstruction. A reed that is clogged, that is partially blocked, that retains some of its original pith, produces a thin, distorted sound. A reed that is perfectly hollowed, perfectly smooth, perfectly empty, produces a sound of extraordinary beauty and depth. The musician is the breath, the instrument is the emptiness, and the music, the creative output, is the product of the breath meeting the emptiness, the divine inspiration meeting the prepared vessel, the information from the implicate order meeting the mind that has been emptied of its own content. The creative act is an act of emptying, of becoming hollow, of removing the self's obstructions so that the divine content can flow through without distortion. The Hindu tradition describes creative inspiration through the concept of pratibha, genius, creative intuition, the flash of insight that illuminates truth directly without the mediation of logical reasoning. The grammarian and philosopher Bhartrhari, writing in the 5th century CE, identified pratibha as the source of all genuine knowledge and all genuine art. Pratibha is not learned. It is not acquired through study or practice. It is revealed a spontaneous illumination that arises when the mind is sufficiently purified, sufficiently still, sufficiently empty of the accumulated content that normally fills it. Pratibha is the Hindu equivalent of the eureka moment, the flash of creative insight that arrives complete and whole from beyond the deliberate thinking process. The Vedic tradition, the oldest stratum of Hindu thought, describes the creative process as shruti, hearing. The rishis who received the Vedas did not compose them through intellectual effort. They heard them in states of deep meditation called tapas, literally heat, referring to the intense inner fire produced by sustained contemplative practice. The tapas practice involves prolonged silence, prolonged fasting, prolonged withdrawal from sensory stimulation conditions that the neuroscience identifies as optimal for DMN activation and filter relaxation. The rishi sits in the forest. The rishi fasts. The rishi is silent for weeks, months, years. The analytical mind exhausts its content. The surface noise subsides. And in the silence that remains, in the vast, empty, luminous silence that tapas produces, the rishi hears the Vedas. The cosmic truth becomes audible. The implicate order unfolds. And the rishi transcribes what they heard, not composing but recording, not creating but witnessing, not producing but receiving. The specificity of the preparation is remarkable. The Chandogya Upanishad describes the preparation for receiving truth as a process of sensory withdrawal, pratyahara, concentration, dharana, and meditation, dhyana, that progressively strips the mind of its content until nothing remains but the pure awareness that can receive the cosmic vibration. The process is not passive waiting. It is active, emptying the deliberate systematic removal of every thought, every memory, every sensory impression, every desire, every fear that occupies the mind's attention. The rishi does not merely sit and hope for inspiration. The rishi works to empty, works to purify, works to create the interior conditions that make reception possible. The concept of vak, speech, word, creative utterance connects the Vedic understanding of creativity to the information framework we have assembled. The Rig Veda describes 4 levels of speech: para, transcendent speech, the cosmic vibration that is the source of all sound and all meaning; pashyanti, visionary speech, the level at which the cosmic truth becomes perceptible to the purified mind; madhyama, intermediate speech, the level at which the perceived truth takes form in thought and language; and vaikari, express speech, the level at which the formed thought is uttered as audible sound. Creative inspiration, in the Vedic framework, is the descent of truth from para to vaikari, from the transcendent source, through the stages of perception and formulation, to the expressed creative work. The rishi does not generate the truth. The rishi perceives the truth at the pashyanti level and translates it, through madhyama, into the vaikari that other humans can hear. The creative process is a translation process, a translation from the implicate to the explicate, from the non-local to the local, from the quantum vacuum's informational content to the specific words, melodies, images, or equations that the individual creator produces. This 4-level model of speech maps onto the neuroscience of creativity with surprising precision. The para-level corresponds to the quantum vacuum, the informational ground from which all creative content ultimately derives. The pashyanti level corresponds to the DMN's associative processing, the level at which the vacuum information is perceived as images, patterns, and connections that the conscious mind can grasp. The madhyama level corresponds to the executive network's evaluative processing, the level at which the perceived pattern is formulated into a communicable form, tested for coherence and validity, and shaped into a creative product. And the vaikari level corresponds to the final output, the published paper, the performed music, the completed painting, the delivered speech. 4 levels. Described by the Vedic tradition 3,000 years ago, confirmed by the neuroscience in the last 2 decades. Coincidence is an increasingly inadequate explanation. The concept of Saraswati, the Hindu goddess of knowledge, music, art, and wisdom expresses the tradition's understanding that creative inspiration is divine in origin. Saraswati is not merely a symbolic figure, she is a theological claim about the nature of creativity. The student who invokes Saraswati before study is not performing a superstitious ritual. They are acknowledging that the knowledge they seek is not produced by their individual effort, but received from a divine source. That the creative act is a collaboration between the human mind and the cosmic intelligence that the Da tradition personifies as Saraswati. And the practices that please Saraswati, purity of intention, humility, devotion, disciplined practice, and the offering of the fruits of creative work to the divine rather than to the ego, are practices that, in the neuroscience framework, optimize the conditions for creative insight. They reduce self-referential processing, humility, they maintain sustained attention on the domain, disciplined practice, and they release the ego's anxious grip on outcomes, offering the fruits to the divine. The Buddhist tradition approaches creativity through the concept of prajna, transcendent wisdom, the direct perception of reality as it is, unmediated by concepts, categories, or the analytical mind's habitual patterns of interpretation. Prajna is not knowledge about reality. It is knowledge of reality, a direct, unmediated seeing that arises when the conceptual mind's filters are removed, and the mind perceives what was always there, but what the filters prevented from being seen. Prajna is the Buddhist equivalent of creative perception, the seeing of new patterns, new relationships, new truths that the ordinary mind cannot perceive because the ordinary mind is trapped in its own categories. The Zen tradition, the most creativity-focused school of Buddhism, developed specific techniques for cultivating prajna through the systematic destruction of the analytical mind's habitual patterns. The koan, a paradoxical question or statement that cannot be resolved through logical reasoning, is the Zen tradition's technology for breaking the analytical filter. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your face before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? The koan cannot be answered by thinking harder. It can only be resolved by thinking differently, or rather, by ceasing to think entirely and perceiving the answer directly, through prajna, through the flash of insight that arrives when the analytical mind exhausts itself against the paradox and collapses into the silence from which genuine creativity emerges. The Zen master Dogen described this process with characteristic precision. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. The creative act, in Zen, is not the assertion of the self. It is the forgetting of the self, the dissolution of the ego's boundaries, the thinning of the filter that separates the individual mind from the universal mind, the opening of the channel through which the 10,000 things, the totality of reality, the implicate order's complete informational content illuminate the mind that has become empty enough to receive them. The Zen tradition's influence on Japanese creative culture is profound and measurable. The tea ceremony, chado, flower arrangement, ikebana, calligraphy, shodo, archery, kyudo, swordsmanship, kendo, and garden design, karasansui, are all Zen arts, creative disciplines that are simultaneously spiritual practices, designed not to produce beautiful objects but to produce awakened minds. The Zen artist practices their art the way the monk practices meditation, with complete attention, with no attachment to the result, with the willingness to fail and begin again, and with the trust that the creative content will arrive when the mind is ready to receive it. Eugen Herrigel, a German philosopher who studied Kyudo, Zen archery, in Japan, described the creative moment in archery with a precision that captures the quantum creativity framework perfectly. The master archer does not aim. The master archer does not release the arrow through a deliberate act of will. The master archer draws the bow, holds the tension, maintains complete attention without the interference of intentional control, and waits. And the arrow releases itself at the moment when the archer's attention, the bow's tension, and the target's position align in a configuration that the conscious mind did not calculate and could not reproduce through deliberate effort. It shoots, Herigel's master told him, not I shoot, it shoots. The creative act is not an act of the ego. It is an act that occurs through the ego's absence, through the emptying of the self, that allows the universal process to operate through the individual without the individual's interference. The concept of mushin, no mind, is the Zen term for the state in which this occurs. Mushin is not unconsciousness. It is consciousness without self-consciousness, awareness without the ego's commentary, perception without the analytical mind's evaluation, action without the deliberate will's interference. Mushin is the flow state described in Zen vocabulary. It is the creative channel fully open. It is the filter at its thinnest, and it is the state in which the greatest creative works of the Zen tradition have been produced, the haiku that captures the entire cosmos in 17 syllables, the brush stroke that expresses a mountain in a single gesture, the garden that embodies the infinite in a finite space. The Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness reflects the Zen understanding of creativity as reception rather than production. The wabi-sabi artist does not impose their vision on the material. They listen to the material, perceiving the grain of the wood, the texture of the clay, the natural curve of the branch, and allow the material to guide the creative act. The artist is not the master. The artist is the servant serving the reality that the material expresses, receiving the form that the material suggests, collaborating with the nature of things rather than imposing the ego's design. This is creativity as perception, the same perception that Bohm described, the same perception that the quantum framework identifies as the reception of implicate information through the relaxed filter of the creative mind. The Christian tradition describes creative inspiration through the concept of the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, the divine presence that indwells the believer and that manifests as wisdom, prophecy, tongues, healing, and the gifts that Paul enumerates in 1 Corinthians. The Holy Spirit is not merely a theological abstraction. It is a phenomenological description of the experience of creative inspiration, the experience of being filled, of being guided, of producing words and actions that exceed the individual's capacity and that are attributed not to the individual's talent, but to the divine presence working through the individual. The concept of inspiration itself is Christian in etymology inspirar, to breathe into. The Holy Spirit breathes into the human vessel. The vessel speaks, writes, creates, but the content is not the vessel's, it is the Spirit's. And the preparation for receiving the Spirit, prayer, fasting, silence, solitude, the purification of the heart is structurally identical to the preparation that every tradition prescribes for creative reception. The tradition records numerous cases of creative inspiration attributed to the Holy Spirit cases that parallel the scientific accounts of creative breakthrough with structural precision. Handel reportedly composed the Messiah, one of the greatest musical works in Western history, in 24 days, barely eating or sleeping, writing in a state of sustained creative ecstasy that he described as divine possession. When he finished the Hallelujah chorus, Handel is reported to have said, "I did think I did see all heaven before me, and the great God himself." The music was not composed through deliberate effort. It was received in a state of overwhelming creative intensity that Handel attributed to the direct action of the Holy Spirit. Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess, whose music and visions we he, having encountered in previous investigations, described her creative process as a living light that illuminated her mind and revealed images, words, and melodies that she then transcribed. The visions were not hallucinations, they were accompanied by acute awareness, by precise memory, and by the capacity for critical evaluation that distinguishes genuine creative insight from psychotic delusion. And the content of the visions, theological treatises, scientific observations, musical compositions, and medical texts was so far beyond the education and training of a 12th century nun that her contemporaries attributed the works to divine inspiration rather than human composition. Gregory the Great described the process. The Holy Spirit will not dwell in a noisy mind. The noise must be silenced, the filter must be thinned, the vessel must be emptied, and then, in the silence, in the emptiness, in the stillness that remains, when the ego's noise has been exhausted, the Spirit speaks. The monastic tradition, both Eastern and Western, institutionalized the conditions for creative inspiration. The monastery is a creativity laboratory, a structured environment designed to produce the silence, the solitude, the rhythmic alternation between work and contemplation, the community support, and the individual discipline that optimize the conditions for creative reception. And the output of the monasteries, the manuscripts, the music, the architecture, the theology, the philosophy, the art, is among the most creative and most enduring in human history. Gregorian chant, Gothic cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts of Lindisfarne and Kells, the philosophical syntheses of Aquinas and Bonaventure, the mystical poetry of John of the Cross and Hildegard von Bingen, the scientific innovations of Roger Bacon and Gregor Mendel. The Irish monks of the early medieval period preserved the entirety of Western classical literature during the centuries when the Roman Empire collapsed and the European continent descended into chaos, copying, illuminating, and transmitting the texts of Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers in manuscripts of extraordinary beauty and meticulous accuracy. The creative output of these monastic communities, produced by men living in conditions of extreme simplicity, sustained silence, regular prayer, manual labor, and communal worship, rivals the output of any secular creative institution in human history. The monastery produced genius not by selecting for talented individuals, but by creating the environmental conditions that allowed the creative channel to open, and the implicate order's content to flow through minds that had been prepared by years of contemplative discipline. The Taoist tradition approaches creativity through the concept of Wu Wei, non-action, effortless action, the action that arises spontaneously from alignment with the Tao rather than from the ego's deliberate intention. Wu Wei is not passivity. It is not the absence of action. It is action that flows from the deeper order of reality rather than from the surface mind's planning and calculation. The carpenter who has mastered their craft does not think about each cut. The musician who has internalized their instrument does not decide each note. The calligrapher who has practiced for decades does not plan each stroke. The action arises from a source that is deeper than thought, from the body's accumulated wisdom, from the unconscious mind's integrated knowledge, from the connection to the Tao that decades of practice have established and that the cessation of deliberate effort allows to manifest. Zhuangzi, the great Taoist philosopher, tells the story of Kukding, a butcher whose knife never dulls because he cuts not through the meat but through the spaces between the joints. I follow the natural structure, Kukding explains. I go where the openings are. The creative act, in the Taoist framework, is not the imposition of form on resistant material. It is the perception of the form that is already latent in the material, the natural structure, the inherent pattern, the Tao that is embedded in every situation, and that reveals itself to the mind that is quiet enough and perceptive enough to see it. This is Bohm's creative perception in Taoist vocabulary, the direct apprehension of the implicate order's structure, the seeing of the unfolded information that ordinary perception misses, the discovery of the pattern that was always there but that the analytical mind's noise prevented from being perceived. The Aboriginal Australian tradition adds a dimension that no other tradition provides. The claim that creativity is not merely the reception of information from a deeper source, but the participation in the ongoing creation of reality itself. In Aboriginal cosmology, the ancestral beings created the world through creative acts, singing, dreaming, dancing the landscape into existence. The songlines are creative works, musical compositions that are simultaneously navigational routes, ecological maps, spiritual genealogies, and cosmological narratives. And the creative acts of the ancestral beings are not past events. They are ongoing. The dream time continues, the creation continues, and the human being who sings a songline, who paints a dreaming, who dances a ceremony, is not merely representing the creation. They are participating in it, adding their creative energy to the ongoing process of reality generation that the dream time sustains. The Aboriginal understanding collapses the distinction between creator and creation, and in doing so, it arrives at a position that is remarkably consonant with the quantum framework. In quantum mechanics, the observer participates in the creation of the observed. The measurement creates the reality. The observation generates the information that makes the quantum state definite. The Aboriginal artist, singing the songline, is performing a quantum measurement, a creative observation that generates information, that makes reality definite, that participates in the ongoing creation of the world through the act of conscious, intentional, creative attention. The convergence across traditions is structural and specific. Every tradition identifies creativity as reception from a transpersonal source. Every tradition prescribes silence, solitude, and the quieting of the analytical mind as preparation for creative reception. Every tradition describes the creative act as a collaboration between the individual mind and a greater intelligence. The Muse, God, Brahman, the Tao, the Dreamtime, the Holy Spirit. And every tradition warns against the ego's tendency to claim ownership of the creative content, insisting that the genuine creator is humble, that the genuine artist is a servant, that the genuine genius is a vessel rather than a source. The Greek tradition, the oldest Western tradition of creative reflection, provides the foundational vocabulary through which the West has understood inspiration. For over 2 millennia, the Muse is not merely a literary convention. In the Greek understanding, the Muse is a divine being, a daughter of Zeus and Mnemosyne, memory, who possesses the knowledge that the poet seeks and who transmits it through the act of inspiration. The poet does not know the story. The Muse knows the story. The poet invokes the Muse, asks for the transmission, prepares the mind to receive it, and then transcribes what the Muse dictates. Plato took this understanding further in the Ion, where Socrates argues that the poet creates not through techne skill, craft, but through enthusiasmos, literally having the God within, being possessed by the divine, becoming a channel through which the divine speaks. The poet in the state of enthusiasmos does not know what they are saying. They are not in control. They are not producing the content through their own intelligence. They are being used as instruments, as vessels, as conduits for a message that originates outside them and that passes through them into the world. Plato describes the creative chain as a magnet. The Muse magnetizes the poet magnetizes the performer. The performer magnetizes the audience, the creative energy flowing from the divine source through the chain of human instruments to the final recipient. The energy originates in the divine. The human links in the chain transmit it. And the quality of the transmission depends on the transparency of the instrument, on the degree to which the poet's ego is absent and the muse's voice is undistorted. Aristotle, characteristically, offered a more naturalistic interpretation describing creative genius as a product of melancholia, of the excess of black bile that produces the altered state in which the mind perceives connections that the ordinary mind cannot see. But even Aristotle acknowledged that the creative state is an altered state, a departure from ordinary cognition, a condition in which the mind operates differently from its normal analytical mode, and a condition in which the content that emerges exceeds what the individual's deliberate effort could produce. 6 traditions, 6 vocabularies, 1 structure. Creativity is the reception of information from beyond the individual mind, through a channel that opens when the filter thins, in a mind that has been prepared by sustained attention and purified by the surrender of the ego's claim to authorship. The final part of this investigation will put it all together: the neuroscience, the quantum physics, the traditions, and address the question that every creative person, in their most honest moments, has asked: where do my best ideas really come from? And the answer may transform not only how you create, but how you understand what you are. 3 investigations, 3 independent approaches to the most mysterious aspect of human experience: the arrival of the genuinely new, and the convergence between the neuroscience, the quantum physics, and the traditions produces a picture that transforms creativity from a talent possessed by the gifted few into a capacity inherent in consciousness itself, a capacity that is latent in every mind, accessible through specific practices, and connected to a source of information that transcends the individual brain. The neuroscience established the mechanism. Creativity is not a single brain process, but the integration of 3 networks: the default mode network that generates associations, the executive network that evaluates them, and the salience network that selects the promising ones. The creative insight arrives when these networks synchronize, when the analytical mind releases its grip, when the DMN's associative engine operates freely in the incubation state that showers, walks, and sleep provide. Beaty mapped the creative brain's enhanced connectivity. Reichel discovered that the resting brain consumes as much energy as the working brain because it is working, in default mode, on the associations and combinations that produce creative insight. Dijksterhuis demonstrated that complex problems are solved better after unconscious incubation than after conscious deliberation. And the savant research Treffert, Padgett, Brogard demonstrated that extraordinary creative abilities are latent in every brain, suppressed by the filtering system that normal cognition maintains, and released when the filter is damaged or removed. The quantum physics provided the source. The implicate order contains all informational structures, every mathematical relationship, every physical possibility, every pattern that could ever exist. The quantum vacuum contains the informational content of the universe encoded on the holographic boundary, preserved by unitarity, accessible through the non-local quantum correlations that connect every point in space-time to every other point. The Ochoa theory proposes that microtubules are quantum antennae, biological receivers tuned to the vacuum's frequencies, delivering information from the implicate order into conscious awareness through the process of objective reduction. Process 1 provides the selection mechanism. Consciousness chooses which template to attend to, collapsing the superposition of creative possibilities into a single, definite, actualized idea. The Zeno effect provides the stabilization mechanism. Sustained attention holds the fragile creative insight in place long enough for the conscious mind to capture it. And the filter theory explains why the channel is normally closed. The brain's filtering system blocks vacuum information because it is not useful for biological survival, and the filter opens only when specific conditions are met: relaxation, incubation, meditation, sleep, flow, or the kind of brain damage that releases latent savant abilities, the traditions provided the map and the technology. Every tradition identifies creativity as reception from a transpersonal source: the Muse, God, Brahman, the Tao, the Dreamtime, the Holy Spirit, the collective unconscious. Every tradition prescribes practices for cultivating the receptive state: silence, solitude, meditation, fasting, rhythmic chanting, contemplative prayer, the systematic quieting of the analytical mind. Every tradition describes the creative act as the collaboration between the individual vessel and the universal source, the flute and the breath, the mirror and the light, the channel and the flow. And every tradition warns that the ego's claim to authorship is the greatest obstacle to genuine creativity, that the mind that grasps the creative content as mine closes the channel through which the content arrives. Now let us confront the objections. The first objection is the recombination objection. Creativity is not reception from a transpersonal source. It is recombination of existing knowledge, the novel arrangement of known elements into unknown configurations, the dissociation, Arthur Koestler's term, of previously unrelated frames of reference, the blending of concepts from different domains into a hybrid that is more than the sum of its parts. The DMN recombines stored memories and learned associations. The eureka moment is the moment when a novel combination passes the evaluation of the executive network, and the source of the creativity is not the quantum vacuum or the implicate order. It is the individual brain's stored knowledge, processed in a novel way by the DMN's associative engine. This objection is valid for most creative acts. Most creativity is recombination. Most novel ideas are new arrangements of existing elements. The chef who combines Japanese technique with Mexican ingredients is recombining. The architect who applies biological principles to building design is recombining. The entrepreneur who applies technology from one industry to a problem in another industry is recombining. And the DMN's associative processing, combining distant elements, finding connections between unrelated domains, producing novel configurations from familiar components, is the mechanism that explains most everyday creativity. But the objection does not account for the cases that motivated this investigation, the cases in which the creative content appears to exceed what recombination of existing knowledge could produce. Ramanujan's formulas were not recombinations of existing mathematics. They were genuinely new results that no mathematician in the world had derived. The acquired savant, who has never studied art, produces artwork of gallery quality not by recombining artistic knowledge they possess, but by expressing artistic knowledge they appear to access from a source that their personal history does not contain. Tesla's engineering visualizations were precise enough to build working machines from a level of precision that exceeds what recombination of general engineering principles could plausibly achieve. The recombination theory explains most creativity. It does not explain the extraordinary creativity that occurs at the frontier of human achievement, the creativity that appears to access genuinely new information rather than rearranging old information. The honest position is that both mechanisms may operate. Most creativity is recombination, the DMN, combining existing knowledge in novel ways. Some creativity may be reception, the quantum channel delivering information from the implicate order that the individual's existing knowledge does not contain. The two mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. They may operate on a continuum, with everyday creativity at the recombination end and extraordinary creativity at the reception end, and most creative acts falling somewhere in between. The challenge for future research is to determine where on the continuum specific cases fall, and to develop the experimental methods that could distinguish between recombination and reception in specific instances. The second objection is the romanticism objection. The tradition's descriptions of creative inspiration as divine are romantic. They attribute to God or the Muse what is actually the product of unconscious neural processing. The artist who feels that their best work comes from somewhere else is experiencing an attribution error, interpreting the products of their own unconscious mind as coming from an external source, because the unconscious processing is, by definition, invisible to conscious awareness. The subjective experience of reception does not prove actual reception. It merely proves that the conscious mind does not have introspective access to the unconscious processes that produce the creative content. This objection is psychologically sophisticated and partially valid. The unconscious mind does produce creative content that the conscious mind did not deliberately construct, and the subjective experience of this unconscious production does feel like reception from an external source. The materialist interpretation that the source is the individual's own unconscious mind is plausible for most cases, but the objection assumes what it needs to prove, that the unconscious mind is limited to the individual brain's stored content. If the unconscious mind is connected to the implicate order, if it accesses information from the quantum vacuum through non-local quantum correlations, then the source is both internal, processed by the unconscious mind, and external, originating in the vacuum's informational content. The tradition's description and the materialist's description are both partially correct. The creative content is processed by the individual's unconscious mind. The materialist is right about this, but it may include information that did not originate in the individual's personal experience. The traditions may be right about this. The unconscious mind is the channel, but the content that flows through the channel may come from a source that is wider than the individual brain. The third objection is the unfalsifiability objection. The claim that creative inspiration comes from the quantum vacuum or the implicate order is unfalsifiable. There is no experiment that could prove or disprove it, because any creative insight can be explained either as recombination, the materialist explanation, or as reception, the quantum explanation, and there is no empirical criterion for distinguishing between the two. This objection has force, but is not as strong as it appears. The acquired savant cases provide a potential empirical test. If a person with no training in a domain suddenly produces expert-level work in that domain after brain damage, and if the work contains specific knowledge that the person demonstrably could not have acquired through normal channels, then the recombination explanation is strained. The knowledge had to come from somewhere. If it did not come from the individual's personal experience, then it came from another source. The quantum vacuum hypothesis identifies that source. And the savant cases, while not conclusive, provide the kind of empirical evidence that could, in principle, distinguish between recombination and reception. Additionally, if the reception hypothesis is correct, it makes specific predictions. Creative insight should increase when the brain's filtering system is reduced, confirmed by the savant research, the psychedelic research, and the meditation research. Creative insight should correlate with brain states that enhance quantum coherence, testable but not yet tested. And creative insight should sometimes contain information that the creator demonstrably could not have acquired through normal channels, documented in specific cases, but not systematically verified. The hypothesis is difficult to test but not impossible to test. And the difficulty of testing is not a reason to dismiss it, it is a reason to develop better experimental methods. Now, let us trace the connections to every investigation we have conducted. The observer effect is the quantum foundation of creativity. Every creative act is an observation, a collapsing of possibility into actuality, a selection of one idea from the superposition of all possible ideas, a making definite of something that was previously indefinite. The creative mind is the observer, and the creative act is the quantum measurement that brings a new piece of reality into existence. Before the creative act, the idea was potential enfolded in the implicate order, encoded in the vacuum, existing as a possibility but not as an actuality. After the creative act, the idea is actual, unfolded, expressed, communicated, real. The creative act is the transition from potential to actual, the same transition that the observer effect produces in the quantum laboratory. The heart investigation revealed that the heart processes emotional information, broadcasts it through its electromagnetic field. Creativity is not merely a cognitive process, it is an emotional process. The creative insight arrives not as a cold logical conclusion, but as a hot emotional event, accompanied by excitement, by the sense of rightness, by the feeling that the insight is true before the analytical mind has verified it. The heart's role in creativity may be to provide the emotional evaluation that the salience network performs, the gut feeling, the somatic marker, the visceral sense of yes. This is it that distinguishes the genuine insight from the random association. The heart knows before the head, the body feels before the mind analyzes, and the creative process that honors this, that trusts the emotional evaluation, that follows the excitement, that listens to the heart's response, may be more effective than the process that relies solely on cognitive analysis. The placebo investigation demonstrated that belief creates biology, and the parallel to creativity is direct. The creator who believes they are a channel, who believes the content comes from a source beyond their personal mind, may produce better creative work than the creator who believes they are merely recombining stored knowledge, not because the belief is true, though it may be, but because the belief relaxes the ego's grip, reduces the anxiety of authorship, and opens the channel through which the creative content, whether from the vacuum or from the unconscious, flows more freely. The belief in the muse may function as a creative placebo, producing real effects not because the muse exists, though she may, but because the belief in the muse creates the psychological conditions that optimize creative reception. The free will investigation demonstrated that consciousness can select from quantum possibilities through process 1. Creative free will is the most consequential form of free will. The selection of a new idea from the superposition of possible ideas, the choice that brings something into existence that did not exist before. Every creative act is an exercise of quantum free will, a process 1 selection that collapses the creative superposition into a specific, definite, actualized idea. And the quality of the selection, the capacity to choose the most profound idea from the superposition, the most beautiful melody from the possibilities, the most elegant solution from the alternatives, is what distinguishes the great creator from the ordinary one. The genius does not have a bigger superposition. The genius has a better selector, a consciousness that is more attuned to the vacuum's informational content, more sensitive to the qualities of depth and elegance and truth, more able to recognize the genuinely new when it arrives. Among the noise of the merely novel, the fear investigation demonstrated that chronic fearful attention stabilizes the feared outcome through the Zeno effect. The parallel to creativity is the phenomenon of creative block, the condition in which the creator cannot produce, cannot access the channel, cannot receive the insight that they desperately need. Creative block is the fear Zeno, the anxious attention to the absence of creativity, that stabilizes the absence, that locks the mind into the block state, that prevents the filter from thinning because the ego's anxious monitoring keeps the filter tight. Every creative person knows the cure for creative block. Stop trying, walk away, do something else, let go. This is the release of Zeno attention, the relaxation of the anxious monitoring that was stabilizing the block state, the letting go that allows the filter to thin and the channel to open. Creative block is not the absence of creativity. It is the presence of fear, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of the blank page, that Zeno stabilizes the closed channel and prevents the creative content from arriving. The subconscious investigation revealed that 95% of cognitive processing occurs below the threshold of awareness, and that the unconscious mind has access to information that the conscious mind cannot reach. Creativity is the most dramatic expression of this unconscious capacity. The creative insight is produced by the unconscious, by the DMN, by the associative engine, by the processing that occurs in the vast computational space below the surface of awareness and delivered to the conscious mind as a finished product. The conscious mind's contribution is preparation, learning the domain, accumulating the knowledge, formulating the question and evaluation, testing the insight, verifying its validity, shaping it into communicable form. But the insight itself, the genuinely creative element, the new thing that did not exist before, is produced in the unconscious. And the unconscious, as we explored in that investigation, may have access to the implicate order, to the quantum vacuum, to the collective unconscious, to sources of information that transcend the individual brain's stored content. The karma investigation demonstrated that intentional actions leave traces that shape future experience. Creative practice is an intentional action, and the traces it leaves shape the creator's future creative capacity. The musician who practices daily deposits daily karmic traces, strengthening the neural pathways associated with musical perception, deepening the connection to the musical dimension of the implicate order, building the quantum coherence that enables more effective reception. The writer who writes daily deposits, daily traces, strengthening the linguistic pathways, deepening the sensitivity to meaning and rhythm, building the capacity for the flow state in which the creative channel opens most fully. Creativity is a karmic practice. The more you create, the more capable of creation you become, not merely through skill development, but through the progressive deepening of the quantum channel that connects the individual mind to the universal source. The synchronicity investigation revealed that meaningful coincidences, acausal correlations between inner states and outer events, operate through the same non-local informational field that the creativity framework describes. The creative insight and the synchronistic event share a common structure. Both involve the arrival of information that the individual did not seek through deliberate effort. Both involve the perception of a meaningful pattern that the analytical mind did not construct, and both occur most frequently when the filter is relaxed and the channel is open. The Pauli-Jung collaboration, which produced both the synchronicity concept and some of Pauli's most important physics, is the most famous example of the convergence between creativity and synchronicity. Pauli's creative insights in physics arrived in dreams that Jung interpreted psychologically, and the interpretation deepened both Pauli's physics and Jung's psychology. The creative act and the synchronistic event were the same event, the implicate order, unfolding information through the prepared mind of an individual whose filter was thin enough to receive it. The OBE investigation demonstrated that consciousness can operate independently of the body, and the parallel to creativity is the experience of creative absorption, the state in which the creator loses awareness of their body, their environment, their physical needs, and exists entirely in the creative work. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal displacement of consciousness from the body-centered, sensory-focused mode to the creative-centered, information-focused mode. The creator who is absorbed in their work does not feel hunger, does not notice time passing, does not register sounds or movements in their environment. Their consciousness has shifted from the physical to the informational, from the body to the work, from the explicate to the implicate. The creative absorption is a mild OBE, a partial displacement of consciousness from the body into the informational domain where the creative content resides. The lucid dreaming investigation demonstrated that consciousness can be aware within a reality that it recognizes as a construction, and the parallel to creativity is the experience of the creator who is simultaneously inside the creative work and aware that the work is being created, the novelist who inhabits the story while knowing it is fiction, the musician who is carried by the melody while shaping its direction, the scientist who is immersed in the mathematical structure while recognizing that the structure is a model. This dual awareness inside and above, absorbed and reflective, participating and observing, is the creative analogue of lucid dreaming. And it is the state in which the most profound creative work is produced, because the dual awareness allows the creator to receive the content from the implicate order, the absorbed, participatory dimension, while simultaneously evaluating and shaping the content for communication, the reflective, observational dimension. The aging investigation revealed that aging is information loss, and the parallel to creativity suggests a deep connection between creative practice and longevity. If aging is the progressive corruption of the cell's ability to read its own blueprint, then the practices that maintain cognitive vitality, that preserve neural coherence, that sustain gamma oscillations, that keep the brain's networks connected and communicative, may also slow aging. And creative practice may be among the most powerful of these practices. The creator who practices daily, who maintains the neural connectivity that Beaty mapped, who sustains the gamma oscillations that accompany creative insight, who exercises the quantum channel that connects the brain to the vacuum, may be building the neural infrastructure that resists the decoherence cascade of aging. The correlation between creative activity and longevity has been documented epidemiologically. Creative individuals tend to live longer, to maintain cognitive function longer, and to show slower rates of age-related neural decline. The correlation does not prove causation, but it is consistent with the framework. Creative practice maintains the quantum coherence that aging degrades, and the maintenance slows the degradation. The music investigation revealed that specific frequencies produce specific states of consciousness, and that the 40 Hz gamma frequency, associated with lucid dreaming and deep meditation, is also associated with creative insight. The creative eureka moment is accompanied by a burst of gamma activity, a synchronized oscillation across the brain's networks that corresponds to the moment of integration, the moment when the DMN's association passes the executive network's evaluation and the salience network's selection and emerges into conscious awareness as a viable, novel idea. The gamma burst is the neural signature of the creative insight, and the practices that cultivate gamma activity, meditation, musical entrainment, focused attention may cultivate creativity by tuning the brain to the frequency at which creative integration occurs. The information investigation established that reality is made of information rather than matter, and creativity is the process by which new information enters the explicate order from the implicate order. Every creative act adds something to the world, a new idea, a new form, a new pattern, a new configuration that did not previously exist in the explicate order. The creative act is an information event, an increase in the explicate order's informational content, funded by the implicate order's enfolded information, mediated by the conscious mind that serves as the channel between the two. Creativity is not merely a human activity. It is a cosmic process, the process by which the universe generates novelty, by which the implicate order unfolds into the explicate, by which the enfolded becomes the expressed. And the human creator, the poet, the scientist, the musician, the inventor, the artist, is the instrument through which this cosmic process operates, not the source. The instrument, not the author, the channel, not the producer, the receiver. Every thread connects, Every investigation points to the same conclusion, and the conclusion transforms the way you understand your own creative capacity. You are not a machine that processes information. You are a channel through which information flows from the implicate order, through the quantum connection, past the filter of the analytical mind, into the conscious awareness that recognizes, evaluates, and expresses the creative content that arrives. The quality of your creativity depends not on the amount of knowledge you have stored, though knowledge matters, as preparation for reception. The quality depends on the openness of the channel, on the transparency of the filter, the coherence of the quantum connection, the emptiness of the vessel, the willingness to receive without grasping, to express without claiming, to create without needing to own the creation. The traditions understood this. They prescribed practices for opening the channel, meditation for quieting the analytical mind, prayer for directing the attention toward the source, fasting for purifying the vessel, solitude for reducing the sensory noise that competes with the vacuum's signal, community for grounding the creative content in shared reality, and humility for preventing the ego from closing the channel by claiming ownership of the content that flows through it. These are not merely spiritual practices. They are creativity practices, the same practices that the neuroscience identifies as optimal for DMN activation, for filter relaxation, for the integration of the three networks that produce creative insight. The practical implications are immediate and available to everyone, not just to the gifted, not just to the trained, not just to the professional creator. Because the capacity for creative reception is not a talent distributed to a fortunate few. It is a feature of consciousness built into the architecture of every human brain, accessible through the quantum channel that connects every mind to the implicate order, and available to anyone who cultivates the conditions that allow the channel to open. The first condition is preparation. The vacuum delivers information, but the unprepared mind cannot recognize it. The mathematician who has spent decades immersed in number theory recognizes the mathematical insight when it arrives. The musician who has spent decades immersed in harmony recognizes the melodic insight when it arrives. The scientist who has spent decades immersed in their field recognizes the experimental insight when it arrives. Without preparation, the insight passes unrecognized. A quantum state that decoheres before the unprepared mind can identify it as relevant. Preparation is not sufficient for creativity, but it is necessary the Zeno stabilization that allows the relevant templates to persist long enough for the creative process one to select them. The second condition is release. After the preparation, after the hours, the days, the weeks of immersion in the problem, the analytical mind must let go. This is the incubation period. This is the shower. This is the walk. This is the transition to the default mode network's associative processing. The release is not laziness. It is the critical step, the moment when the filter thins, the channel opens, and the vacuum's information can reach the conscious mind. The creator who cannot release, who clings to the problem, who works harder and harder, who refuses to step away, closes the channel. The analytical mind's intense, focused, effortful processing tightens the filter and blocks the vacuum's signal. The solution is not more effort, it is less. Not more thinking, less. Not more noise, more silence. The third condition is attention. When the insight arrives in the shower, on the walk, in the dream, it must be captured immediately. The quantum state is fragile. The insight will decohere if attention is not sustained. Beethoven's Notebook. Coleridge's interrupted poem. The melody that dissolves before you can hum it into your phone. The Zeno effect is the creator's friend. Sustained attention stabilizes the creative quantum state and prevents it from dissolving. But the attention must be receptive, not analytical. The moment you begin to evaluate the insight, to judge it, to critique it, To analyze its validity, the analytical mind re-engages, the filter tightens, and the remaining content that was about to arrive through the open channel is blocked. Receive first, evaluate later, capture the entire download before you begin to process it. The fourth condition is humility. Every tradition insists on this, and the insistence is not merely moral, it is functional. The ego that claims ownership of the creative content closes the channel through which the content arrives. The claim of authorship is an assertion of the self, an activation of the default mode network's self-referential processing, a tightening of the filter, a closing of the channel. The creator who says, "I am a genius," is less creative than the creator who says, "I am a flute." Because the flute is open, the genius is closed around the self-image, closed around the pride, closed around the ego's need to own what it received. The tradition's universal prescription of humility is a creativity prescription, the instruction to keep the channel open by keeping the ego small, to maintain the receptive emptiness by not filling it with self-congratulation, to preserve the hollowness of the flute by not stuffing it with the pith of pride. The next time an idea arrives in the shower, on the walk, in the moment before sleep, pay attention to the experience, not to the content of the idea, to the experience of its arrival. Notice that it came from somewhere you cannot identify. Notice that it arrived complete, or nearly complete, without the laborious step-by-step construction that deliberate thought requires. Notice that it feels received rather than produced, caught rather than thrown, given rather than earned. And then ask yourself, where did it come from? The materialist says, from your unconscious mind, recombining stored knowledge in novel ways. This may be true. It is certainly part of the truth. The unconscious mind is a powerful engine of recombination, and most creative ideas are novel arrangements of familiar elements. But the traditions say something else. The traditions say, from beyond, from the implicate order, from the quantum vacuum, from the Muse, from God, from the Tao, from the luminous ground of reality that contains all possibilities and that unfolds specific possibilities through the minds of those who are prepared to receive them. And the quantum physics, for the first time in the history of science, provides a framework in which the tradition's claim is not mythology, it is physics, a non-local information field, a holographic boundary that encodes the complete informational content of the universe, a quantum channel that connects the individual brain to the universal field through the coherent oscillations of microtubules, a filter that normally blocks the channel but that can be thinned through meditation, through incubation, through sleep, through the practices that the traditions have been prescribing for millennia. The idea did come from somewhere, and the somewhere may be deeper, wider, and more magnificent than you have ever imagined. The flute is hollow, the breath is infinite, and the music, your music, the creative expression that only you can produce, because only you are, this particular flute, with this particular hollowness, in this particular moment of the universe's unfolding, is waiting, not to be invented, to be received.